I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session of our Fall Learning Series, 6 Days Shall You Labor? Perspectives on Work in Jewish Text and Tradition. A special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today. We are so pleased to have our esteemed alumnus, Dr. Jonathan Ray, teaching us today on Jewish work and Jewish identity in the Middle Ages, which I think is a period we have not yet focused on in this series. So we're really excited to learn with him today, and Tani will tell you a little bit more about him in a moment. I also want to thank our sponsors for today. We have Sadiq level sponsors, the $1,000 level, Susan and Stan Tenenbaum, who have sponsored today's session in memory of their parents, Helen and Monroe Sidney Brown, and Bessie and Morris Tenenbaum. Thank you so much to you, Susan and Stan Tenenbaum, for making today's session possible in memory of your parents. And everyone else, if you're feeling inspired by this learning opportunity with JTS's outstanding scholars, we hope you'll consider sponsoring a session as well. We have 3 sponsorship levels, and you can learn more by emailing learninglives@jtsa.edu. So on that note, Tani Schwartzherman, I turn it over to you for some announcements before we begin learning.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Just to quickly go over how we'll do Q&A for today's session, similar to how we do for all of our sessions. Dr. Jonathan Ray will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have a Q&A period at the end. You can use your chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Jonathan Ray. For any technical or logistical questions, you can initiate a private chat with either myself or with Lynn Feynman. And the sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link, and we will be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Jonathan Ray, a JTS alumnus and the Samuel I. Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University. Dr. Ray was also part of the first cohort of JTS Fellows, a program which aims to expand and diversify JTS's adult learning opportunities. Professor Ray specializes in medieval and early modern Jewish history, focusing on Sephardic Jews. He has authored several books and articles in this area. His forthcoming book, Jewish Life in Medieval Spain, A New History, illuminates interfaith relations in Spain from the Jewish perspective. Professor Ray, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
And now I'm unmuted, so you can actually turn it over to me. Hello, everybody, and welcome. It's always great to be here, although via Zoom, with the JTS crowd. It's a little bit different now being associated with the first cohort of anything. It does make you feel a little bit older, but as the years go by, it's always still good to be engaged with things that are going on Upper Broadway, even from as far away as Washington, D.C. So welcome, everyone, and it's nice to be here. I am going to speak a little bit about Jewish work and Jewish jobs in the Middle Ages. We're going to look at a little bit of text together, and we're going to pause a few times, and Julia will help moderate some questions. So if you're thinking of questions, you can jot them down or put them in the chat and save them up, and we'll have special dedicated time to handle those as we go through. So when we think of the Middle Ages, we tend to think of medieval Europe, and perhaps not the Jewish society of medieval Europe. We think of perhaps knights in shining armor and castles and cathedrals. And in the academic world, the Middle Ages is often presented as a society made up of those who work, those who fight, and those who pray. So the question is always, where did Jews who lived in the Middle Ages fit in this general scheme? Well, Jews weren't really among those who fought, which was the professional military class or the knights, in large part because they're not part of this feudal pyramid that bonds a vassal to a lord, to a higher lord, eventually to the king. Jews also, for the most part, in most parts of the medieval world, are not expected to or even allowed to bear arms for the most part. They are sort of outside of those who fight. And even when it comes to those who pray, many of us would think, well, Jews certainly do pray. Aren't they classified in that regard? Those who pray in the Middle Ages are seen as those who pray rather than working, those who pray as a profession. These are the monks or the clergy, the priests of the Middle Ages. And while Jews certainly do have prayer as a focal point of their lives, and they do have their own version of clergy in cantors and in rabbis and judges and other members of the community of the synagogue, the shliach tzibur, etc., none of these are formal permanent positions in most medieval Jewish societies. They're either voluntary positions, or even where we do have examples of a rabbi being hired by the community or a cantor being hired by the community, for the most part, these are part-time gigs. Most of these rabbis, most of these cantors have a day job for the most part. So they tend to be merchants, or they tend to be physicians. They tend to have other jobs. And so the Jews don't really fit in quite there either. So it's really, Jews are among those who work. That's the way you would best classify the Jews in the Middle Ages. And in many Christian and Muslim texts, Jews are classified not only by religion, but by the jobs they do. That the Jews are allowed to live in a Muslim or Christian society because they perform a welcome or an important set of economic functions. So work really is a defining aspect of who the Jews were in the Middle Ages for themselves, but certainly for the societies in which they lived. Jews are not only going to be invited into these societies because they offer something to the economy, but are very often going to be expelled or marginalized in those societies over time because that function is no longer as necessary as it once was. So when we think of Jewish work in the Middle Ages, it really is, in many ways, as important as Jewish religious identity when it comes to who the Jews were and how and why they were allowed to operate in non-Jewish society. When we talk about those who work in the Christian context, we tend to think of agriculture. Most Christians are peasants. Most Christians are involved in direct agriculture. And that's going to be something that distinguishes the Jewish worker in the Middle Ages. Most Jews were not involved in direct agriculture. We have some Jews who are, certainly Jews who owned small plots of land and had in some periods Jews farm them, although in later periods mostly non-Jews are involved with the direct agriculture. The areas in which Jews are involved in farming tend to be in viticulture. So we have Jews being involved with the production of kosher wine in various aspects, though in some areas they also own small orchards of fruits or other plots of land. The number one thing, therefore, that Jews are involved in, if it's not agriculture, is not going to be trade, although we'll talk about that in a minute. It's not going to be medicine, although that was very important. The number one thing Jews are involved in when it comes to work is artisanal work or craft work. Jews are almost always, in most society, the vast majority of them involved in some sort of handiwork, something that perhaps doesn't first come to mind when we think of Jewish work, but we think of some of the Jewish surnames that have survived into modernity, names that are Schneider or tailors or cutters. We begin to realize, oh, right, Jews were very much involved in the trades, and in particular trades to deal with cloth or clothing. There's a reason for this. In many parts of early medieval society, and even going back to Roman society, weaving or other jobs associated with clothing were often on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. That is to say, Jews were allowed to be weavers or tailors or cloth cutters or embroiderers or similar occupations because it was considered to be low work, the work that other people didn't want. And that gives us a sense of who the Jews were in many medieval societies. They were allowed in to do the work that perhaps other people didn't want to do. In addition to working in the cloth trades, Jews were very populated in the analogous trade of leatherworking. They were tanners, or they worked with animal hides. They were engravers. They were shoemakers or bookbinders. Books were bound in leather at a certain period. So the dyeing of cloth was considered a smelly and messy work. The working with dead animal hides and the work of tanning, which was the processing of tanned hides, was a very smelly and messy work. These were jobs that most people didn't want. And so in both Muslim and in Christian society, Jews fulfilled those artisanal rungs of the lower part of the socioeconomic ladder, in part because that was their position in society. They were not, for the most part, the leaders of these societies. And so they did the jobs that no one else wanted to do. In some areas, a cloth merchant or a leather merchant could rise to a very prominent position in society. There were certainly successful leather workers or tanners, successful cloth merchants who made a lot of money, but for every very wealthy cloth merchant, there were many, many more people in the cloth trades working on the lower echelons of dyeing and carding that cloth that were more typical of the Jewish world. In addition to these professions, you had some which were perhaps not considered quite as dirty or as onerous, and those were professions that were associated with metalworking. So in addition to working with cloth and leather, Jews were very often involved in being smiths, being silversmiths or goldsmiths in particular. Working with all metals, but particularly with precious metals, was considered a step up from working with cloth or with leather hides. It wasn't quite as smelly a process, and you could generally sell these goods for more money, especially when we're talking about silver or gold goods. In fact, we do have Jews being contracted by churches to make objects for the church, crosses, reliquaries, where you would keep a relic or a special box to keep a relic in, other fine silver or gold chalices that would be used in churches. So we see Jews very much plugged into the world in which they lived. And if you were an artisan with some skill, you were highly desired. Some of these artisans made a very good living and were prized throughout the Christian or the Muslim world for their work. In addition to those jobs, you had the full sweep of the sort of trades that were necessary for a Jewish community: butchers, bakers, millers, masons, glaziers, or people who were with glass, furriers in certain parts of Europe, certainly. So Jews were really involved in all sorts of trades, and we're going to look at some texts later, or we'll have the chance to look at some texts that give us a sense of the types of trades Jews did. But that's what, when you think of Jews in the Middle Ages, the first thing that should come to mind is they were working with their hands. And they were working with their hands very often in jobs that were not particularly desired by others. The last thing I want to mention, and we can pause for some questions on this, is that Jews were also at times, although this wasn't the primary jobs that most Jews had, involved in entertainment. I know that today, very often in the United States, we think of Jews in the entertainment industry. We do have Jewish jugglers, or players, as they're often called, entertaining Christian and Muslim audiences with song, with dance, and with performances of different kinds, so that perhaps the very beginning of Jewish stand-up or the very beginning of Jewish entertainment industry can be found at the royal and episcopal courts of medieval Europe. So we do have listed as so-and-so, the Jew who came to entertain the court with his music playing, his singing and whatnot. Okay, so this is this sense of the Jews as workers for most of the Middle Ages, and we'll get into some of the more well-paid and important positions in a minute, but they tend to be the exception, not the rule. So I wanted to open up for any questions here before we move on to those other professions.
Great, thank you. This is already so fascinating, and some things I knew and a bunch of things I didn't know. So at this stage, we have kind of some clarification questions. So can you define the period that you're referring to
Sure.
with everything you're
What's
talking
the
about?
Middle Ages? So let's say generally 500 to 1500, since it's a nice 1,000-year sect of time. It also coincides with not necessarily important dates in the Jewish world, but since Jews are minorities living in other people's world, the dates that really shaped the medieval world might be seen as in the 5th century. You have the fall of Rome or the sack of Rome for the last 2 times. And then the 15th century with the discovery of the Americas by the Columbus voyages, or maybe the rediscovery of the Americas, if you're a Leif Erikson fan, a new period might be opening then in 1492. So let's say between the 400s and the 1400s.
Okay, so kind of our standard definition of the Middle Ages is what you're covering. One question was the reason that Jews were not in agriculture when so many common people were, is that because they weren't permitted to own land?
That's a great question. And the short answer is not necessarily. There are some areas in which it's assumed that Jews won't own land, but it's necessarily on the books. But the major problem is that Jews are not allowed to rule over Muslims or Christians. This becomes the standard Roman formulation of things that gets inherited by the Middle Ages and the societies in which they lived. To own your own plot of land and have your own garden, you could have you and your cousin and 5 other Jews do it. But if you're talking about latifundia, if you're talking about large tracts of lands, you need lots of laborers, and Jews were not allowed to be lords over Christian peasants or over Muslims. And so that was more the issue there, that Jews very often do come into landholding in many places. As we'll see in a minute, sometimes they get, those who are in money lending will get repaid in land for debts that are owed to them. So Jews do become landowners, but they're almost always absentee landowners and not lords of that land in the direct medieval sense.
Fascinating. Okay, so it's not about land ownership; it's about hierarchy in society. Yes. Okay, and another question is, someone was noting that a lot of these jobs are portable. Does that also play into why Jews may have had some of these trades?
It's a great question. So I would say there's a chicken and an egg question here. So certainly the portability allows Jews to do it, as the Jews are a highly mobile people against their will very often, but not always in the Middle Ages. Having said that, the only jobs that really aren't portable are the jobs they're not allowed to do, such as working the land or fighting and defending particular lands. So sure, there's a portability there, but I think it aided the Jews in many ways, but I don't think it's the reason that the Jews are going into those professions. The reason Jews go into professions is because it's what's left of them, for the most part. That's why they go into those professions. It's what they're allowed to do.
Okay, and I bet you can guess what everyone else is asking, which is, why hasn't he yet mentioned money lending and banking? So I don't know if you want to defer that or do that.
You don't bury the lead, folks. That's why I didn't mention it. So yes, I want to start out with a little bit of things we don't think of when we think of the Jews in the Middle Ages, because I wanted to remind everyone that's what 90% of Jews did. We're going to get into money lending in a second, as well as trade, as well as Jews as physicians, because those are things perhaps we more readily think of about the Jews in the Middle Ages. But we're headed that way, folks. Any other questions here before we move on?
Maybe. I don't know if there were questions about women and also questions about people were curious about about the entertainment a little bit more. I don't know if you're planning to follow up on either of those.
So we do women a little bit later. There's not, I mean, if you have a specific question about entertainment, I can ask it because we're not going to revisit that again, but.
Just kind of more detail, like what sort of songs or performances were they doing for non-Jewish audiences?
So you have to imagine Jews are fairly, even though they're perhaps marginalized in the social hierarchy, they're very much involved and integrated into the societies in which they lived. Jews walked the same streets, they lived in the same houses, lived in the same marketplaces as others. And so the songs they sang and the songs they played and the types of music they played were influenced by the musical trends of the day. Jews didn't speak Hebrew, right? Lashon HaKodesh was just that. It was a holy tongue used for liturgical purposes and for study. You might use the Hebrew language to write in, but you spoke whatever anyone else spoke. So you spoke versions of German, you spoke versions of Latin or Latinized languages, Romance languages, early French, early Occitan. You spoke versions of Arabic. And therefore were really engaged linguistically and musically and culturally in the surrounding world. Not too differently than American Jews today would be speaking English and being involved in the cultural currents of their age. So they played the same instruments for the most part. They sang similar sort of songs. They had some Jewish women who were hired. This is an odd aspect of the entertainment industry as professional wailers or bereavers at funerals. So Jews and Muslim women were both thought to be able to emote very well at funerals. And so this was part of the chanting out dirges and wailing and playing tambourines and the like would be something that you would have at non-Jewish funerals, and you would have bands, sometimes mixed bands of different types of women who would come do this.
Fascinating. All right, so I still have questions coming in, but why don't you continue with your
Sure.
teaching?
We'll have time later, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, before we move on to questions of money lending, which is another profession Jews are sort of pushed into slowly over time. There are other areas that perhaps we look at as much more prominent and much more important than being someone who worked with dead animal hides or dyeing cloth, and that's courtiers. So there are in both Muslim and Christian kingdoms and principalities of the Middle Ages, Jewish advisors, Jewish courtiers who would advise on questions of finance, on questions of politics sometimes, but for the most part were tax collectors. Perhaps the number one thing, in addition to medicine, which we'll look at in a second, the number one thing Jews did at the upper tiers of society was they would work for their lords as tax gatherers or tax collectors. And this is sort of a great understanding can be had, I should say, of the Middle Ages and the Jewish role within it when we look at the tax collector, because on the one hand, these are among the wealthier people of society. You could get a lot of money doing tax collecting. On the other hand, it was an onerous job that did not win you any friends. Neither then nor now did anyone really greet the taxman with joy. And so they were chosen as tax collectors, and we'll see also as physicians, to the royal courts because they were expendable. The Jews become a buffer between those who want to collect funds and the people they want to collect from. The Jews also become someone who can be charged with going out, collecting money, and this is very important, returning. So a king would never send his oldest son out to collect his money because the oldest son might keep it for himself and declare his own role on the throne. Jews can't rule. Jews can't undergo a coup d'etat. Jews are powerless politically in both the Muslim and the Christian worlds. And so you can send Jews to collect your money and expect them to come back and give it to you because they are politically so weak and not going to be able to run away with those funds. The same goes true with physicians. We'll talk about Jewish physicians in a minute, but Christian and Muslim lords very often like Jewish physicians because they're not going to poison them as readily. I mean, of course, they could be working for your brother or your eldest son, but for the most part, they themselves are sort of eunuchs of a kind. In this case, they can't fulfill the role of caliph or pope or bishop or king or emir. And so they're often seen as a good bet for people in those positions to hire, to be their body men, to be those people closest to them. And this is not just for Jews. We see that very often Christian and Muslim lords would have a personal guard of people who are loyal only to them, maybe because they've been taken as boys from other households, et cetera, and their only allegiance is to the king, because as a king, as a ruler, you might declare yourself as protector of all Muslims or all Christians, but you're really worried about your Muslim and Christian subjects revolting and throwing you out. So you want to surround yourself by people who are dependent upon you, and Jews are sort of universally dependent. That role, however, has social consequences for other Jews. We'll see Jews who write with great pride that, oh, you know, the tax collector in this particular city is a Jew, or this king doesn't do anything without meeting with his Jewish advisors first, and that makes the Jews feel important and enfranchised in a way. There are others who write, however, that they worry that just but for a slip of the tongue or bad luck, this king can fall on hard times and blame those Jews, not only those specific Jewish physicians and tax gatherers who work for them, but that all Jews will feel the repercussions of that should the things not go their way. So there's a great pride for many Jews that there are some wealthy, powerful Jews at the palace representing them. There's also a sense of fear that at any moment, the average Jewish tanner is going to have to pay for the slip of the tongue of a Jewish physician or tax collector. And that's an important aspect of how Jewish workers saw those Jews at the top of the financial ladder. When it comes to tax gathering, that brings us into this question of money and of money lending. Jews are considered money changers in the Middle East. Those of you who've been on vacation and seen you can change dollars into euros or whatever. Those were often a role that Jews had in the Middle East, but not only Jews, that merchants were often merchant bankers at this time, that they were engaged in the exchange of specie or of different types of money, as well as trading in goods. And so Jews who would, in the Muslim world and the Christian world, cross boundaries and travel from one area to the other, became experts in trading currency and changing currency, as well as trading goods. because they could pass easily between Muslim and Christian lands, something that during periods of strife, Muslims or Christians may not have been able to do. But again, because of their neutral role being a group that doesn't have any military power, the Jews were sort of natural middlemen, and that role as natural middlemen economically also helped them become money changers. In the Middle East, this was not quite the role it later became in Christian Europe. In Christian Europe, the issue more became with this question of lending money at interest, which is different from money changing per se. Lending money at interest, what we now call banking or the credit industry, was something that was already established well in Europe around the year 1000. So by that time, if you ever go to Europe and you'll see the center of the city, the Vieille Ville, the Centro Città, whatever it's called, you'll usually see plaques there around the year 1000, 1100 is when these buildings are built. So this is a great period of urbanization in the high Middle Ages. Between 1000 and 1200, you have this great flourishing of cities or of early city centers throughout Europe. That costs money. Those of you who know such things, you need the credit industry in order for these large building projects, for these great cathedrals or castles to be built. The Jews become an integral part of this. Why? So this is going to be money lending 101 in a nutshell. I'm happy to take questions later, but essentially there is a biblical prohibition understood by Christians and Jews, both, that you're not to lend money at interest to your fellow. In the medieval world, fellow is understood as people of your own religious community. So a Jew could lend a Jew $10, but would have to get $10 back. If you want to charge interest, you're supposedly not allowed to do that between members of the same religious community. In Europe, where Jews are a very small percentage of even the cities in which they dwell, let alone the overall society, the Jews have a larger market share. So yes, a Christian could lend money at interest to a Jew, and sometimes did, but the business of lending of interest favored the Jewish minority being able to lend to this larger 98% of society at interest as well. Those exchanges of credit are regulated, but not regulated well for most of medieval history. They're regulated locally. There's this notion that you can't charge excessive interest, but what excessive is changes from time to time and place to place. There's a difference between excessive interest flat, you can only charge a certain percentage, and how often you can increase that rate of interest. Are these short-term loans, long-term loans? How often does the interest compound, et cetera? So there's always ways to get around whatever data, whatever laws are put in there. But generally speaking, Jews are allowed to lend money at interest to Christians and become a major bulwark of an economic boom that happens in Europe around the High Middle Ages. Not long after the fact, however, it becomes clear that not everyone is benefiting from this economic boom, that there are many people on the lower ends of the economic ladders in the Christian society who become hopelessly indebted and are not able to pay off their debts, even within what is the norm of Christian lending. And so we start to see this term usury being used in the 13th and 14th centuries. Usury is charging excessive interest. And again, it's an emotional term, it's a general term, it's not a careful legal term, because the establishment of what is and what isn't accepted interest is very changeable and variable depending on time and place. But there's a sense that what Jews do in charging interest is bad because Jews are bad. And so almost all Jewish lending is considered usury by some elements of the church starting around the 13th century. There's a lot of complications here which we can get into, and I'll get into some of them, but I want to really focus on the way in which money lending changes Jewish work. First of all, it's something that almost all Jews get into regardless of professions by about the 13th century. That is to say, Jewish physicians lend money, Jewish tailors lend money, Jewish merchants lend money. By the 13th century, almost all Jews lend money to some degree in order to make ends meet. So as they get pushed out of different professions by Christians who want those professions to go only to Christians, as Jews are pushed out of cobbling, they're pushed out of the baking and butcher professions by Christian bakers and butchers. And as they're narrowing their markets, more and more of these artisans and physicians and merchants get into money lending in order to make ends meet. That said, there are certainly large-scale Jewish bankers who lend large money to kings and who fund armies, but they're really the exception, not the rule. For the most part, Jews who are involved in money lending are involved in money lending as a part-time job. They're involved in money lending to farmers and to other artisans, very small-scale loans, and loans that are chronically underpaid as far as repayment goes. So not only are Jews forced into money lending over a period of time, it becomes a less and less lucrative profession, as Christians simply aren't able to pay. And if someone's a peasant with very little to give, there's not much collateral you can gain out of this. So the first thing is, Jewish money lending for most people involved isn't a great deal. The second thing to know is that it's an incredibly problematic profession for interfaith relations, you might say. The idea that Jews spiritually, religiously, should not be above Christians in any way. They shouldn't have power over Christians. They shouldn't enjoy a better life than Christians. They shouldn't have nicer houses than Christians. Can give you a sense of what it means for a Christian to owe or be indebted to a Jew. The act of being indebted to Jews, while it's something the church technically allows, is something that is extremely unpopular on religious grounds. The notion of a Christian owing something to a Jew, especially owing to Jews money they can't pay back, is incredibly problematic. And it gets a lot of negative emotions flowing through society. Many of the riots that take place against Jews in the Middle Ages, both in the Muslim and Christian world, very often are accompanied with ransacking of Jewish homes in the search for debt records or ledgers that are going to be torn up. So it's not just a sense of, oh, during Easter, there's this religious animus about the Jews killing Christ, and Easter week's a bad time for Jews, and they should stay locked in their houses. And we do see some Easter violence. There might be a religious aspect to that violence, but it almost always has an economic motivation as well to wrest Jewish tax records, or rather debt records, from Jewish lenders as a way of protesting the economic situation that has been established by people farther up the social ladder than most peasants. Why don't we take another pause there to see if anyone has any questions on this?
Okay, yes, lots of questions. We're one question, there's a bunch of questions about the money lending. Were Jews pooling money as a community to lend out, or was it all kind of happening on an individual level?
It's rare that Jews pool money. Now, there are Jewish, there's an institutional Jewish presence. So there is the community of a particular city, and that's sort of the Jewish municipal fathers of that kahal will get together, and they will borrow money collectively and loan money collectively. But that's a small portion of it. For the most part, you're talking about individual private lending. 2 or 3 lenders might make short-term partnerships with each other, but they're always short-term and dissolvable partnerships. You don't have pooling of money for the most part. Okay.
Then there were also questions about Christians lending money. So, one person asked, they wrote it this way, but certainly the most important bankers / usurers were Christians, such as the Medici, and,
right,
and others who might be less famous. Is that the case?
Sure. So one of the things we're seeing is Jews really are invited into much of Europe in order to help become economic catalysts, not only for the building of cities, as I mentioned, but also to support warfare, to support agricultural advancement, et cetera. So you think from the year, let's call it 950 to 1250, to give you some years. The Jews are one of the, I shouldn't say this way, Jewish involvement in money lending is incredibly important, both to the Christian society, but also to Jews, right? It's one of the reasons they're brought in to Europe. By around 1250, you begin to have the incipient forms of Christian banking realizing this is very lucrative for them as well. And you have the Medici in the 13th and 14th century begin to rise as these major bank families, and the banchieri, these bankmen or benchmen, that's where the name banking comes from, starting in parts of Italy and then spreading throughout Europe. So the 13th century is a very transitional period. And by the 14th century, you really have this interesting dynamic in which Christian society is condemning Jews as all being usurers, all of them, even some poor Jewish peasant who's just, peddling pieces of metal thimbles. We have these interesting inventories of Jewish peddlers. They're carrying a few needles, a few thimbles, a patch of cloth, 2 shoes that don't match. That's what many Jews are involved in. That Jew would be considered a usurer and a moneylender by Christian society at a time when these large banking families are beginning to establish themselves in Italy and elsewhere, Germany as well, earning lots of money and not having to put up with that notion that they are usurers. So there's that overlap in the late Middle Ages in which Jews are being blamed for excessive lending and excessive credit, while Christians who are beginning to do the same thing and quite successfully too, don't receive the same amount of blame. Although we do have some people in the church condemning them as being no better than the Jews, put it that way. The Medicis take this with some equanimity and move on. But yeah, you do begin to have in the 13th and 14th century a sort of passing of the torch, if you will, of involvement in the world of credit from Jews to Christians, at least in the European area.
So, but all of these kind of small time lenders, you're saying that it wasn't really unique to Jews. It's just that there was a totally different kind of focus on Jews who did it. Like the Jewish cobbler and the Christian cobbler might be lending in the same way. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that. Jews, so small scale lending becomes more and more common with the Jews. Large scale lending becomes more and more popular among the Christians because it's more lucrative. Technically speaking, Christians are not supposed to be lending at interest to other Christians at all. That becomes sort of winked at over the course of the High Middle Ages. The church wants to push everyone out of lending. The church has this idea that we're going to have a society that will have no credit. The nobles and the kings realize that's economically unsound and impossible. So they come up with these sort of fictions in which Christians are giving gifts and receiving a gift in return, and the gift might be more valued than the original gift. So there's all these fictions that develop that allow Christian banking to happen. So you have Jews are much more involved up and down the social order of people involved in banking. Christians, it's much more of a particular class, and it's more lucrative. And you also have different standards of what is allowed and what is not allowed, both publicly and privately.
Okay, that's helpful. So with Christians, it's sort of more institutionally, it's happening kind of on an institutional level, whereas Jews, it's like any Jew might be lending money. So it really becomes associated with sort of every Jew in a way that the Christian lending happening on an institutional level doesn't.
Right. So we can talk about this for a long time. I don't want to spend the whole time on money lending, but there's also a theological portrait of the Jew or projection of the Jew as being carnal, material, this world, and the Christian as spiritual, higher-minded, eternal, right? Judaism has been superseded by Christianity. Judaism only cares about the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law. And so painting the Jews as caring about money has a theological reality as well as an economic reality. Whereas Christians, if I'm Christian, I can't be guilty of being materialistic because after all, I'm a Christian, right? If I'm involved for business, it has to be for the greater glory of something, right? So there's that aspect of it as well, although there's certainly people who chuckle at Christians. There are Christians who are aware of the silliness of this and say, no, we know this is big business and we're in it for the big business.
I had a few questions left from before, if you want to go do something other than money lending. And I just want to say that this is, I think it's a painful topic, right? There's just the volume of anti-Semitism over such a sustained period associated with this. It's just to name that. So a few people had asked, going back to the tradespeople and the artisans, about guilds, and were Jews allowed into guilds, or did they form their own guilds, or what role did guilds play?
I know there may be other questions in this, but I'm going to seize on this one as a segue because I wanted to share a text with you of a Jewish guild. So we're gonna do that right now, and I'm going to preface this before I share my screen with the following. Jewish guilds or confraternal organizations exist at the same time that Christians do, but very often the types of guilds we're going to look at here are Jews copying Christians for the most part. There were Hevrot or confraternal societies within Jewish communities that usually were dedicated to a particular activity, as they are today. So you have the Bikur Cholim Society for caring for the sick, and the Hevra Kadisha for making sure Jews get proper burials. There's other charitable societies for making sure young women have dowries, et cetera, et cetera. Sometime beginning in the High Middle Ages, you also begin to have an interest in Jews coming together to form confraternal societies or Hevrot over shared jobs. So you have the Hevrot of the tanners, or the Hevrot of the cobblers, or the Hevrot, of the tailors. And they begin to become a sort of a hybrid between these groups that would care for each other as far as religious dicta would say. You have to take care of the widow and the orphan. You have to take care of the poorer members of your community. And also this idea of mutual labor organizations are, we want to control how many cobblers we can have in the city, because there's a limit of cobblers if we're going to make a living, and we have to control the number of cobblers and the prices that we set, et cetera, which was more the Christian model. So Jews begin to borrow from older Jewish models of fellowships and organizations, and also borrow from this idea that of labor organizing, really from the Christian world. And I want to take a look at, comes from a slightly outsider period. It's the 17th century, but it's an example of things you might find in the 14th or 15th century as well. And this is a text, sort of a constitution of the group of cobblers of Krakow, the Barbers, not cobblers, the Barbers of Krakow, Poland from the early 17th century. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. All right, can we see this? All right, so this gives you an itemized list of the things that the Jewish Barbers of Krakow, Poland cared about. And you'll notice it starts out with this first thing, that they are obligated to make a weekly collection for charity among their members, receiving as much as the generous instincts of each one would give. So it's voluntary. They're not saying each one has to give a set amount. This is something that maybe grows out of voluntary charity giving from the synagogue as well. This idea that the very first thing they're asking people to do is to give to charity for mutual aid. You'll see the footnote down below. It says probably for widows and family members of those members of the guild who are deceased. It's interesting, though, that this becomes the first thing, right? There's this notion that these guilds are going to become kehilot in miniature, right? So you in most societies pay a certain amount of taxes to your Jewish community, and that Jewish community has a hekdesh or charitable fund to take care of these things. But now, in addition to the Social Security you get from the federal government, you're going to have your special sort of Landsmannschaften. These are sort of early Landsmannschaften, people from similar walks of life, similar areas, in this case a similar profession, who will take care of themselves over and above the kind of services that might be given to them by society. So number two, no barber may keep in a shop more than one apprentice, right? There's this idea of, oh, well, maybe one guy's hiring a bunch of apprentices to do all the work. He's not breaking the law, but he's basically squeezing everyone out by having a lot of apprentices, and this isn't okay. This apprentice must eventually bind himself for 3 successive years. During the first 2 years, the apprentice shall, under no circumstances, be permitted to bleed a patient. So we have a sense of these barbers, as you might have heard, this is not just the Christian world. Jewish barbers as well were early surgeons and medical professionals. So that the bleeding of a patient would be something that they would do, but you can't do that unless you've been an apprentice for at least a few years. And even in the 3rd year, he shall not be allowed to do this except when his master is at his side. So we get this sense of what were the problems, what was going on that someone needed to push back on. It's like, okay, we're finding this one guy, he hires a bunch of apprentices and then he goes out to lunch and they do all the work and they're not really well trained. And this isn't good. We have to sort of control who's in the profession. We have to set some rules on against what they say later is slipshod practice of the profession. That probably came into being because there were some complaints of some slipshod practices among the barbers of Krakow. And that's why we have this. In number 3 here, right? Each barber may, as is the custom, engage another apprentice as a partner who is to get 1/3 of the profits. So they're setting up what can be distributed as far as profits are concerned. However, such an apprentice, I want to get this here, such an apprentice may be employed only on the specific condition that the majority of the members of the above mentioned association agree to allow him to become a partner. So now we have this sense of people joining this profession, and then I am able to tell you whether or not your apprentice is good enough to become a partner, and you are to be able to do the same thing with mine. So there's some controls on there by joining this profession. I want to jump down to, there's a lot here, but I'm going to jump down to some of the other ones here. Number 4, they also have agreed that all apprentices who bind themselves to work in a barbershop, whether as an apprentice for 3 years or as a partner in the above stated manner, are compelled, first of all, to obligate and record themselves in the minute books of the Jewish community to the effect that they will not marry a local girl in order not to cast additional burdens on the people of the community. May their rock and their Redeemer guard them. So we also can imagine that there were problems of people coming from outside the community, joining the confraternity or the guild of the barbers as a way in, as a way of social mobility, marrying these local girls, maybe not being able to take care of them, right? And they're trying to control this as well. And for number 5 here, the above mentioned barbers, let me get this up here, have also bound themselves not to raise prices and thus impose a burden upon the people of our community. They will accept the fee that people have been accustomed of old to pay for bloodletting, cupping, hair cutting, and the healing of bruises and wounds, so as to not to give rise to any complaint against themselves on the part of the people of our community. This also gives us perhaps some sense of what was going on. And how it had to be regulated. The next sentence reads, on the other hand, they will not cheapen or lower, God forbid, their fees by being too liberal and foregoing that which is in their just due by accepting less than 1 groschen net from everyone for cupping. So here we get a sense of what were the kind of things barbers did. We don't want to raise the prices too high, but someone at the meeting said, hey, if we're talking about capping the prices, we should also talk about the basement here. We can't lower prices too much, otherwise we're going to put each other out of work, God forbid. And so we have this this little codicil being put in there on what they could and could not do. The last little bit I want to talk about here before we move on is number 11, which I thought was interesting. So not only do these guilds set themselves up as economic groups and social groups that would establish regulations for all members to enjoy, but number 11 interests me too. The 7 barbers, there are actually 6. If you have a copy of this, there's only 6 barbers who are signed here. So I don't know if this was changed later, but there's only 6 signatories. But they call the 7 barbers above mentioned have also agreed that there shall be brotherliness and friendship among themselves, and that during the 3 festivals, probably the 3 pilgrimage festivals, they will have a good time, enjoy themselves to the full, and be glad and merry of heart. So I always thought this was interesting. They are regulating not only prices, but they're regulating joy and happiness, that you're expected to enjoy yourself and you will have a good time and you will be joyful and merry. That gives us sort of a little insight into how these guilds thought of themselves as regulating not only prices, but other aspects of life as well. And we'll have a chance to look at some of these other documents as well, but I want to stop the screen share for a minute and move on before we do. I thought the barber thing was interesting because we don't necessarily think of barbers as physicians. Jews were overrepresented in the field of medicine for their numbers in society, not only as barbers, but in a number of areas. Some of them would be called physicians and have the term magister or master associated with their name. Others were sort of lower level curers, surgeons. Surgeons were not necessarily considered a higher or more advanced version of physician there, but they were true sawbones at the time. There were people who would bleed people, such as these barbers. Women, so when asked about women who were involved in a variety of different areas, often in business with their family members. So women are very rarely independent in business, but we'll see women transacting business with their husbands, with their brothers, and with other family members in all sorts of fields, from selling artisanal goods to lending money and collecting it as well. But we also see women directly involved as physicians or as curers, midwives in particular, but not only midwives, people who are druggists or experts in various pharmaceuticals. We have women in the Christian and Muslim world going to certain Jewish women who they know to be experts in certain medical areas. And we also have examples of Christian municipalities trying to attract Jewish physicians that they had heard had a good reputation. So for all of the negative we see about Jewish moneylenders, and the church certainly putting out the word that all Jewish money lending is usury, all Jewish money lending is bad, there are other members of Christian and Muslim society who say, we need a physician here. We'd like to have a physician in this town on retainer. Let's attract some Jews here by giving them usually good tax offerings. You don't have to pay taxes for 5 years. The first 5 years you live here, you can live in any house you want. So there seems to be, in some areas, an acknowledgement that Jewish physicians were in demand, and that Christian and Muslim societies were interested in giving Jews, particularly Jewish physicians, a tax break in order to entice them to come to their cities. You could also imagine, however, how this might have played with Christian or Muslim physicians. Not always that good. So just as Christian cobblers or tailors would try to push Jews out of their town, saying there's not enough jobs to go around and Christians should come first, we should outlaw anyone who's not part of the Christian guilds. So too do you have the beginning of early medical colleges starting sometime in the High Middle Ages, banning Jews from studying there. So if Jews want to study, they have to study with individual physicians or private tutorials. Sometimes this is a problem, sometimes not. Basically considered, if you're a Christian or Muslim who believes that this Jewish physician is efficacious, you're going to hire them despite what popular opinion is. But popular opinion often could be quite against some of these Jewish physicians, usually spurred on by their competitors, by the Muslim and Christian physicians. We have a case in Mamluk Egypt in the 14th and 15th centuries of Muslim physicians trying to push out all Jewish physicians from the royal court as a way of saying this is improper. No Jew should have this position in society of caring for the Sultan's body. And they succeed, at least for a period of time, in pushing the Jews out. So we see a little bit of both. These are positions that could gain a lot of notoriety and a lot of financial benefit and honor for Jews. It's also something where that financial benefit and that honor could bring some unwanted scrutiny and jealousy from your competitors within the same community. Any questions on that before we move on?
We do have questions. That was a fascinating source. All right, first of all, this was news to me and other people as well about barbers drifting into medicine. Can you just explain that for us?
So I would say medicine later leaves the barber world. In other words, we're thinking these guys who don't belong in medicine have drifted into medicine. That's not the way it was. People who own knives were surgeons, right? So butchers and barbers very often, you got something to care for, we'll take care of it. Some of you may know this, the classic red and white barber pole, this was red bandages drying on a white pole. That's what the original symbol was. You knew a barber shop because it was a place that had bloody bandages draped around a pole. That's how you knew where you could go for a barber. That's where that symbol comes from in the West. And so, yes, you got problems with health. Very often you'd have a diagnostician who was someone who was an educated person who would study these things in their original languages, often Latin or Arabic, depending, sometimes Greek, but usually that Greek has been translated by this time into Latin or Arabic, sometimes Hebrew, but again, much of the Hebrew comes originally from Greek sources. And those learned people would very often not touch patients. They would send you to get bled by someone, and that person might be a physician, they might be a barber, both sort of existed on the same spectrum.
I will never look at the barber pole
That's where it comes from.
Right, the guy with the knife. Fascinating. Okay. All right. So there was a lot of interest, as I said, in that source that you just shared with us. It just about the dynamics within the Jewish community. So people were interested in this issue of the apprentice not marrying a local woman. Was that sort of because we want the person to leave and we only have room for so many people in this profession, or we're concerned that they're going to leave and abandon their wife? What was going on?
Because they're not earners yet. We don't want students marrying. We want make sure you can have an income, you're a partner, and you're enfranchised, and then you can take care of a wife and a household. They're worried that if these students start marrying them, they're going to be a burden on their women. Their parents are going to have to still take care of the young couple, and they don't want that. They want to wait for these guys to get their degree first.
So they can provide. Got it. Okay.
Earn their union card first. Yeah.
One person also asked if this piece about saying that they would enjoy the holidays, could that possibly have been an implication that they all agree not to work on the holidays and again do some market regulation that way?
Sure. It's just the phrasing is funny, right? So it's not just we forbid you to do any kind of work on the Sabbath or holidays, which is they said, but there will be merriment, like it or not. I thought was sort of a funny phrasing of it. Yeah. Yeah. That does seem to be part of it, though. Yes.
Someone shared just an interesting story that's from the 1850s, which is obviously much later than what you're talking about, but it seems very similar about a family ancestor who was a butcher on the Lower East Side, and there was an agreement among all the butchers about pricing, and they all paid in a certain amount of money that they would lose if they violated the price floor, and that it was kind of a matter of pride in the family that the ancestor was trustworthy and responsible enough to kind of hold on to that pot of money, while also giving the extra chickens to the poor housewife. And anyway, it's kind of an interesting.
Absolutely. And we see these things already in the Middle Ages. So we tend to think of the Jewish world vis-a-vis perhaps their Christian and Muslim neighbors, and sometimes those were amicable and sometimes those were tension-filled relationships. But the same tensions existed within the Jewish world. Like we got all these things together, and here Ray is breaking our rules, and he's hiring too many apprentices, and he's having them undercut our prices, and we can't have this. And so you see this sort of trepidation among Jews who are like, look, there's not an endless amount of work here. We're getting squeezed by the Christians as it is. We can't keep hiring apprentices. There's only so many barbers, tanners, whatever we can support in the society. And this becomes particularly problematic towards the end of the Middle Ages, as Jews are being expelled from one country after another in Europe, and as there's a huge economic downturn in certain parts of the Muslim world as well, and Jews are flowing into the larger cities from these smaller towns. You can imagine the economic stresses that are put on there. And they're like, look, we don't want to turn away fellow Jews because tomorrow we may be in need as well, but there's a realistic set amount of how much work there is in this community. And you have to join the guild in order to work here. And before you join the guild has to have a meeting, decide, can we take on another member? Is there enough work? And so this does pit Jews against each other because there's a limited amount of jobs to go around.
I'm not sure where this question was coming from, but someone asked if there was a connection between medicine and kind of drug work with sorcery. Was that something that was associated with Jews?
Yes. So once you've established that, I don't want to use the term anti-Semitism necessarily because it's a little bit anachronistic, but when there's an anti-Jewish attitude, it can permeate all sorts of things. You start looking at the Jew sideways because you don't trust them in anything, then the Jewish banker is a usurer. And the Jewish artisan does shoddy work and overprice charges for his goods. And the Jewish artisans are trying to undercut the Christian artisans because they're not to be trusted in fair dealings, and their weights and measures are all off because they got a thumb on the scale, et cetera, et cetera. And when it comes to Jewish druggists, how can you put something in your body? How can you take a medicine from someone we don't even trust? They don't even have faith in the real God. How can you possibly do this? So there's people cast aspersions on Jewish druggists as being Jewish physicians as being no better than sorcerers, Jewish druggists as being alchemists. There's all of this negative aspersions cast upon this. But you also have to remember that this isn't just Jews. As much as people want medical help, there's also a sort of fear of doctors. A lot of people die in the hands of doctors. A lot of people died from taking medicine. In fact, people weren't always diagnosed well in the Middle Ages. So there is sort of a fear and loathing of druggists in general, but Jewish druggists, for some, that's just, why would you ever go to a Jewish druggist? And the short answer is, despite those jealousies or those negative associations, if someone says, I don't care what they say, the old Jewish lady by the river knows her stuff and she saved my uncle, that also has an effect on people's popular opinion. Yeah, I hear Jewish druggists you can't trust, except one guy. I know one guy, he's okay.
I can keep going with questions, but I don't know if you want to move on to other
A
material
little bit
first.
to the end, because I see it's about 3 o'clock now. I want to take a look at a little bit more before we move on. And that's to look at merchants. So while very often we think of merchants as sort of the great profession that Jews had along with money lending in the Middle Ages, as with money lending, most merchants were peddlers. Most merchants weren't grand silk merchants traveling from India to Spain and back again. Some were, but they represent a fairly small percentage of Jewish workers in the Middle Ages. And even those people who are silk merchants, for every millionaire silk merchant, you think lower down in the pyramid, there's someone sweeping up the stockroom where the silk is kept someplace in Alexandria, Egypt. So most people involved in merchant trade, international trading houses, are on the lower levels of things. One of the benefits, however, that Jews have when it comes to international trade is that they are able to trust other Jews in ways that perhaps Christians don't trust other Christians, or Muslims don't trust other Muslims as openly. I don't want to say that Muslims didn't go into business with each other. They absolutely did. And there are some Christians who trust each other. But a Christian from Poland very often sees himself as a Pole, and a Christian from Italy as a Sicilian or a Venetian, etc. Whereas a Jew from Venice might see a Jew from Poland as a fellow Jew, both following halakhic codes that were similar enough that allowed them to trust and go into business with each other. So whether it's a shared legal and religious background, or just a common fragility in their societies, right? A common precariousness of their life, allowed Jews to create sort of the first multinationals, if you will. Jews would trade with each other fairly easily across fairly long distances. And that was something that both Christians and Muslims recognized, that a Jewish family would have a cousin or a brother in a variety of different ports that would help the flow of goods in places perhaps that Muslims and Christians couldn't as easily reach. So I want to talk about that a little bit. While there's only a small number of wealthy merchants, merchants were part of the Jewish world as well, and an important part. They sort of tie together money lending and artisanal work. Very often, Jews were multifaceted in this regard. A cobbler would sell his wares and sometimes use that money to go as an investment to lending. So someone would be an artisan, a merchant, and a banker all at the same time. That multifaceted nature of Jews was very typical of Jewish work in the Middle Ages. Even as we talk about specialization, people would say, oh, I'm a cobbler. Oh, really? You don't lend money? Me lend money? I also lend money. Turns out I also do this. And I also, with my cousin, have a side business that does this. So this was very common for the Jews in the Middle Ages, born in part out of necessity, because it wasn't very easy to make a living just as one thing. You didn't really have the protections of the feudal system that you did in say, Christian Europe, et cetera. So if I can, I want to share my screen again with you to look at another text. This one comes from the 16th century. It's a text by a German banker and traveler who is no friend of the Jews. He's traveling to the Ottoman Empire and seeing there, really for the first time, large numbers of Jews. Excuse me, getting things popping up here. The argument here is that Jews are not someone you see in Europe in the 16th century. Most of them had been kicked out. And so when he shows up in the Ottoman Empire, he's somewhat struck by the number of Jews there and gives us a little bit of a taste, perhaps not a very pleasantly regarded taste, but gives us a sense of what the Jews were involved in there. So he notes here, there are all sorts of artisans among the Jews in the Ottoman Empire who make a living selling their products publicly, for in Turkey, every man is free to carry on his trade at home, in a shop or on the streets. This was something striking to him. He came from Europe where Jews were highly regulated. They were usually let back into the Holy Roman Empire only on short visas, we might call them. They could be there for a year or 2 years and then were kicked out again. They were not allowed to ply their trade anywhere they wanted, but in very specific places. And there's a very strong societal pressure for them not to raise their prices, et cetera, et cetera. But here in Turkey, it seems to be much more of a free market, and that strikes him. And he notes, whether he is skilled or not, knows little or much, no one has a word to say if he only pays his tax to the Sultan and his rent on his shop. So there's this notion here that as long as Jews pay the authorities really don't care what they do. You don't have to belong to a guild. You're not regulated. It's more of an open free market. And he notes, there are cloth shearers among the Jews and some among the Greeks too. The Jews of Constantinople also have a printing press and print many rare books. This is interesting because it gives us an example. This is in the mid-16th century, that not that long after the printing press is first established in Germany, Jews get into printing. And we have printing presses and Jews printing books in Spain before they're exiled at the end of the 15th century. We have Ashkenazi Jews very famously establishing important printing presses in Italy. As they're kicked out of Germany and settled in Italy, they establish printing presses there. But we also see here in the Ottoman Empire, the printing of books becomes a major part of the Jewish world that really wasn't there before. Jews had copied and bound codices, handmade books in leather-bound areas. But now Jews have evolved into printing as an important part of their world. And it goes on here. They have goldsmiths, lapidaries, painters, tailors, butchers, druggists, physicians, surgeons, cloth weavers, wound surgeons, barbers, mirror makers, dyers, silk workers, gold washers, refiners of ore, assayers, and engravers. And these are all in many ways associated professions. We think of druggist, physician, surgeon, and I might add barber and butcher on that list, and wound surgeons as similar things, but clearly these were slightly different specializations they would have. The same thing would go in the cloth trade, although he doesn't mention it here. He would talk about people who would sew versus people who would embroider, people who did piecework or people who fixed collars to shirts, people who were hat makers, people who were undergarment makers. So all of these were specializations that were noticed. And you also see that Jews are involved in various things to do with metal, including making mirrors, which have this metal backing. Gold washers, refiners, assayers, and engravers are all involved with the metal making businesses. Some of them are on the lower ends, some of them are on the higher ends, but it gives you a sense of the different sorts of Jewish artisanal work at this time. And then he goes on in the next paragraph, their medical doctors cannot be learned in medicine and surgery, for many of them know no Greek or Latin and are not students of philosophy. So for him, this is what a real doctor needed. You needed that background in Greek, Latin, and scholastic Christian philosophy. Those of whom I have heard know nothing beyond Hebrew and Arabic. So he's not really someone who thinks a lot about Arabic medicine. And at that time, generally speaking, in Europe, Arabic and Hebrew medicine was looked down upon, not just by this guy, but by, generally speaking, by the 16th century, Latin medicine was considered to be more advanced. He's not exactly right that Jews didn't know any Latin medicine, but many people in the Ottoman Empire were still using older Arabic and Hebrew books. Those of whom, he continues, I have heard know nothing about this. They have stolen everything from Galen and have a few prescriptions which they have gotten from Italian druggists in Italy and from their parents who were druggist clerks. So he's not going to give the Jews any props for doing anything well. They took everything when they were working as shop clerks from real established druggists and physicians. There are no other learned doctors in Turkey. And then he stops and he says, well, there is one, however, by the name of Solomon Ashkenazi, who used to frequent the embassies. He knows Latin, he knows philosophy and Italian quite well. He has brought speedy relief to some people. And then finally says, as almost an aside, the Sultan has never used any but a certain Jewish physician, this is Moses Hamon, our editor tells us, who probably rendered good service, and people should not learn to know such rogues. So I'm going to stop sharing here for a minute. Here he has a sense of, even as he's negative, even he's saying, none of them know Latin. Well, I mean, some of them do, but he's a total rogue. And you would never want to go to a physician, but this foolish Sultan has decided to take on a Jewish physician and relies on him completely. So here we have really at the end of the Middle Ages, an example of these same themes going on. Christian and Muslim leaders would rely on Jews very often as court physicians. Some of those physicians had great power and esteem in the non-Jewish world. They lived in very nice houses. They lived a life that was really in many ways detached from much of the Jewish community, perhaps not unlike the differences of wealthy and poor Jews today, or middle-class Jews even today. But on the ground, there were Jews plying that same trade of physician or druggist or wound healer in a much less lucrative way. Just this is what they did. They were on the street corner. They had their little shops. They had, they would go from door to door offering to bleed people's wounds, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them were peddlers, essentially plying their ware door to door. Some of them had their own shops, and they had their place along all sorts of metal workers, cloth workers, and leather workers as really an established part of Jewish society. If we have time, it's 3:11. Julia, tell me how close to the end you want me to end.
I think 10 minutes or so would be fine.
Okay.
Does that work?
One more text, see if I can put it in here. The exile. Let me see if I can find the right place for us. Okay, so this is a text written about the same time, but this time also about the Ottoman Empire, but this time it's by an Italian Jew, as I share my screen here, named Moses de Rossi, who has traveled from Italy, which is not a place where a lot of Jews want to live in the 16th century, and I'll tell you why in a second, to the Ottoman Empire, and has become somewhat fascinated by seeing the same things that our German traveler saw. So the German traveler was like, the Jews, I didn't read every word, but if you have these texts, you can read. In Constantinople, the Jews are thick as ants. There's Jews everywhere, and they're not even regulated. They're allowed to ply their trade wherever, and the Sultan doesn't even care. And the Sultan even has one of these Jewish rogues as his own personal physician, and it's total chaos over there. A Jew from Italy goes over there and says, Jews can ply their trade wherever they want. There's nothing stopping a Jew from honest work. Even the great Sultan who rules the empire sees fit to have a Jew as his surgeon, right? So the same things are viewed very differently by a Jew and a Christian at this time, in part because in the 16th century, things have really gone downhill for the Jews of Italy. There's two popes in a row, Paul IV and the Fifth, who established some very harsh rules against the Jews. This is the beginning of ghettoization and establishing ghettos for Jews, first in Venice and then throughout much of what's left of the Jewish world of Christian Europe, that the Jews are harshly being attacked in some ways. Jewish merchants are being invited in, and even former converso merchants returning to Judaism in Italy are welcomed by some of these Renaissance princes who are looking to make money. But the backlash by a series of very anti-Jewish popes makes it very difficult for Jews to live and to earn a living. And so those Jews who are merchants are constantly on the lookout for, okay, things are bad now and we can get expelled from here at any minute. What's going to be the next place for us to settle? And some people, I'm hearing good things out of the Ottoman Empire. Things seem to be going well there. And he visits there and he's writing back to his family saying, yeah, things look really good here. He gives us a little bit more detail than just good versus bad, but it's very interesting to see how a Jew views this as well as a Christian. So he starts off at the bottom of this page by saying the exile, right, the galut here in the Middle East is not like the galut in our homeland. The Turks, I'm going to scroll down, hold respectable Jews in esteem. I like that. He would note that there are some Jewish robes there that he would never associate with, and those shouldn't be held in esteem. So he's not saying all Jews are good, but the Turks know a good, upstanding Jewish merchant like myself when they see him. Here in Alexandria, Egypt, Jews are the chief officers and administrators of customs and of the king's revenues. So he doesn't have this fear that perhaps a Jewish rabbi or moralist would have. I hope those rich Jews who are hanging out at the palace aren't causing problems for us, because you know what happens when they kill the Jewish courtier. The Jews in the Jewish quarter are next. He doesn't look at it that way. He says, this place is great. The head customs officer dealing with all the trade coming in and out of the port city of Alexandria, he's a Jew. This is a guy we can deal with. Isn't this great? He says, no injuries are perpetrated against them in all the empire. I wouldn't say that's true. It's a big empire. There are some injuries that are perpetrated, I should say, against Jews. But generally speaking, he's like, it's not like Italy. It's pretty good here. You don't have the violence against them that we do back home. Only this year, in consequence of the extraordinary expenditure caused by the war against this Persian Shah, were the Jews required to make advances of loans to the princes. Part of the money came from the taxes on the Jewish quarters, and part came from the town revenues, which the Jews tax farm. So we know that the Jews are also involved in tax farming. Scholars, however, did not have to pay a penny except for the poll tax. So here he's sort of giving a sort of backhanded compliment. He's quietly saying Jews do have to pay a poll tax. That this is known as the jizya in the Ottoman world, that non-Muslims still had to pay a tax for not being Muslim. And so Jews, you move there, you're going to be taxed because you're not a believing Muslim. But he's not going to worry so much about that. They still honor people of establishment, so that they have Jews running their customs offices. A Jewish scholar is exempt from paying the poll tax. This is not true in Italy, where Jews are taxed heavily. So he's comparing it one place to another and says things here are not that bad. And he continues here. All articles of commerce are available in these regions. Fibers, spun and unspun, are exported from Safed in great quantities. Also gallnuts, scammony, oil, honey, and silk in smaller quantities. And for those who don't know, gallnuts and scammony are plants that are used for medicine. So scammony was a purgative. But so we have these medicines, these fibers, these silks, and as well as oil and honey are traded. And from the adjoining regions come crimson silk, corded carpets, and all kinds of spices, including pepper, cloves, ginger, cane spices. Many people, including Jews, buy these goods and merchandise. Okay, so we have a sense here of maybe much more of the famed Middle Ages of one merchant going on and on about, oh, there's spice traders and silk traders, and they come from all over. Most Jews are not involved in this, but for those who are, a very good living could be found. I like this little last bit, and we'll end on this. My daughter-in-law and my grandson Moses are here with me, and tomorrow we shall walk around Safed, God willing. My wife Sarah, since she has come to Safed, has recovered with God's help. So there is also a sense that for those who've been to Safed or Sfat, the cool air of the mountains was medicinal. It was a good place to go and rest up if you're not feeling well. For the water and the air are unusually good here. For this reason, illnesses are few here, and therefore the art of medicine does not flourish here, and physicians do not earn much of a livelihood. So it's a great place for merchants, not very good for physicians, because he says, sick people eat cucumbers, both of the large and small variety, squash, and many kinds of fruit. So the Ottoman Empire is a great place to go if you want to get away from the horrible popes of the time. It's a great place for merchants, not such a great place for physicians. All right, so this gives us a little bit of a sense of the different types of jobs and the different perspectives Jews and non-Jews might have on those jobs. So I just want to wrap up a little bit here, and then we can open up to any final questions you might have. One of the things we learn is that there's a sort of cyclical nature to Jewish work generally in the Middle Ages. Jews are brought in when they're needed. We don't have any connections to finance, and so if I as a lord want to turn my cow town into a city, I'm going to look for an inversion of funds, an injection of money wherever I can find it, and Jews are a big part of that. Jewish merchants also take the backwoods of Europe and connect it up into the much more cosmopolitan areas of the Mediterranean world, where cities like Rome, Constantinople, and Alexandria are all quite large trading entrepôts. In time, however, as Europe develops, the Jews are pushed out. And as they are no longer needed, they become more easily demonized and eventually expelled. This is true generally speaking, but also per profession. Finally, we also see that there is a sense of the Jews as their own society regulating themselves. So it's not just a question of Christians pushing them out, but Jewish guilds are also worried about other Jewish competition. They're worried about members within the same guild perhaps not being on the same page. So there's an urge to regulate themselves as there is to fear regulation from the outside as well. And finally, one of the things we look at is that Jews always have to be, and someone brought up the idea of mobility earlier, Jews always have to be on the lookout for a new place to apply their trades. I don't know that that's why they go into certain trades. It seems they go into certain trades because that's what's left to them or allowed to them. But certainly you had to be mobile, you had to be good at a couple of different things, and you always had to have your eye out at where are they hiring? Where are they in need of Jews? And one of the clear ends of the Middle Ages is the opening up of new markets and new possibilities in the New World. And that it's not long that Jewish merchants sail off for the Caribbean and sail off for the eastern coast of the United States, because once again, we have areas that are in need of anyone who can contribute to a developing society, and that's something that the Jews will benefit from. So that's it for today. I'm happy to take some final questions.
Wonderful. Well, my chat is filled with thanks for such a wonderful session. I learned so much. I think everyone did. I definitely have remaining questions. So kind of connected to what you were just saying, one person asked if, the fact that Jews were sort of, forced into certain areas and kept out of others, like the like agriculture or kind of the clerical professions we talked about, and just what you were saying, kind of just needing to go where the work is. Did that potentially lead to innovation and sort of taking more risks in a good way, becoming particularly skilled? Were there positive outcomes of that?
I'm sure there were. I wouldn't say innovation. I think, if Jews could not work with dyeing wool and dead animal hides, they would get out of it as soon as they could. Sure, there were Jews who became well known as, good metalsmiths and good tanners, but that's something they'd rather not be known for. They'd much rather be known for something that would be make them more money and have them come home smelling less. There are all sorts of talk about the Jewish neighborhood in town is the one that physically reeked. It smelled like it as dead animals, and you affix dye to wool very often through urine. So you can imagine what Jewish neighborhoods smelled like, and they were always trying to put downwind from the Christian and Muslim neighborhoods. So yeah, I don't think it really pulled innovation. I think it motivated people to get out of those professions as soon as they can.
I was wondering what the smelly piece of textile work was. Now I know. Someone also asked if you mentioned at a certain point that how trade was facilitated by Jews feeling connected to each other across national borders, or whatever the equivalent was at that time. Did that also lead to kind of conspiracy theories about Jews controlling things?
So at that point, no. At that point, you don't have those conspiracy theories. That comes later. That's more of 18th and early 19th century invention. You do have the sense that Jews are everywhere against Christians or against Muslims, but it tends not to be because they have connections internationally, just because of their religion, that the religion impels them to do terrible things. Okay.
A few people ask about Maimonides, and right, because he's someone who we know about his profession, a famous guy. So I guess one type kind of category of question was, how did he climb the ladder? Was there a path for climbing the ladder that was theoretically available to Jews in general? And you need to talk about that a little bit, or was he more kind of a fluke that he had a position of such prominence?
So I wouldn't know if he's not a fluke, in the sense that there are a certain class of Jews who do rise to the top of the profession as royal physicians and tax gatherers. So working in finance and working in medicine are potential routes to the top. As we saw, not all physicians get there. Not all physicians become Maimonides or become the courtier of some other lord. You have to be good, you have to be connected. And so sometimes it's luck and sometimes it's not, but very often Jews will be told that study hard in these particular areas because these are of value to our lords and masters, and you can go far. Some people succeed in that result and some don't. Maimonides, having some native abilities that the average Jew doesn't have, makes him an excellent physician and an excellent scientist and an excellent writer and an excellent manager of his own time, et cetera, et cetera.
So you shared, obviously, certain primary sources with us. A few people were asking more broadly, just how do we know all this? So maybe could you summarize for us a little bit, like what are the different types of sources that you've assembled this whole picture for us, right, based on?
So I have what we had minutes essentially from a guild meeting, a constitution of a guild, and we had 2 private letters. We have lots of letters. We have lots of customs house registers. And so this guy said, hey, I was in Alexandria, and the guy who runs the customs house there is a Jew. And in fact, we have customs registers that this merchant came from this city and came to Alexandria, and it's stamped by this guy, the Jew. So we know that he's there. Some descriptive or chronicles we have of so-and-so came to town with his Jewish physician. The Jewish physician saved his leg, even though it was wounded in battle. And so we have chronicles that accounts as well. So a variety of different types of sources, mostly from non-Jewish sources, although we also have rabbinic responsa, which talk perhaps more broadly without giving names. It's the nature of what survives in responsa of, in our town, we organize this way. We have these different chavrot, which allow for foreigners to join them, but only after they lived in town for a year. So we have certain rabbinic responsa as well as sources.
That's interesting. So mostly non-Jewish sources.
Mostly non-Jewish sources. Most of what we know about Jewish history in any era is from non-Jewish sources. Mm-hmm. That's what survives more often.
Right. So maybe just to squeeze in one last question. So you started by talking about Jews in cloth and clothing related work, which which really had staying power. I remember going to a class once about the garment industry, and the teacher started by asking everyone to go around and share, why did they come to that class? And something like 19 out of 20 people there had a family connection to the garment industry, myself included. Can you say anything about how did we stick with that one?
So it's a good question. So I can give you my own sort of off-the-cuff interpretation. I don't know that's necessarily accurate. I think that very often necessity becomes the mother of invention. So Jews are originally pushed into weaving, sewing, dyeing because it's a poorly paid profession, and it's not that particularly skilled, and it is, et cetera, something that's open to Jews. After a while, with automation in the 18th century, 19th century, you begin to have the ability for people who have some familiarity with the clothing industry to actually make some good money. And you're like, well, everyone needs clothes. And so if we can start, supplying the Russian army, or we can start supplying, the uniforms for this group or that group, we can actually, there's, very low cost, we can make a lot of money on this. And so the Jews were already familiar with this business, I think expand into it in this way. Had, for whatever reason, spices far overtaken clothing as a lucrative profession in the 19th century, many of our ancestors would have stayed with and improved the spice industry rather than the clothing industry.
Got it. So it started from necessity, but then became an opportunity.
Right.
All right. So you've managed to tell us, you covered a 1,000-year period and just really brought out, these overarching trends, peppered with all this color and specifics that were just fascinating. So thank you so much. I learned so much, and again, the chat is full of positive comments. So can you just tell us when we can expect your book to come out?
Hopefully 2022, depending on how fast things are going in these days of supply chain slowdowns, but inshallah 2022.
Okay, great. And the name again of your book is Jewish Life in Medieval Spain, A New History. Thank you so much again. And thanks to everyone for coming. Thank you once again to our sponsors, and hope people will join us next week. Dr. Rachel Rosenthal will wind back a couple 100 years or so and look at professions of the Talmudic rabbis who like the rabbis in the Middle Ages that you were telling us about, Professor Ray, were not full-time rabbis the way people like myself have the luxury of being.
Right.
Thank you again for teaching us today. Thanks to everyone for joining us. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Be well.